Welcome back with me to the channel Vision Doge, where today I'm going to be covering some custom cards from my Discord server. And I'm not going to lie, this was actually really overdue. Like, really overdue. Like, oh my god, can you guys stop? In these videos, I'm going to be talking about the cards in two sections. One about design and one about balance. Yeah, if you can't tell, I'm very inspired by Trump's custom Hearthstone format. I really like those videos, even though I don't like Hearthstone. But essentially, at first, I'm just going to talk about the idea of the card and how much I like the idea. And I'm not going to, like, factor balance in at all. And if I ever propose any kind of changes to the card that would make it overpowered, I'm saying these would improve the design of the card, assuming you adjusted the cost or the stats to make it match in power level. Also, before we get into these, I want to clarify something about design which confuses a lot of people. Sometimes when people talk about a card being badly designed, they'll say it's because this card is always going to be super overpowered or absolutely useless, and then they'll dock design points for that instead of balance points. And a lot of people will look at that and be like, well, isn't that a balance problem? But that is more of a design problem, because technically you can make a card that's always overpowered or always garbage balanced, quote unquote, if on average it does win like a pretty even amount of games and lose a pretty even amount of games. But that's not really healthy for the game, is it? So it's more of a design problem then. In a similar vein, that also kind of applies to cards that aren't good enough to see play. But even if they were made good enough to see play with the mechanics they have, they would just break the game and make it unplayable. That also would be a design issue more than a balance issue. But yes, of course, the other thing I'd be judging it on balance would just be, is this too overpowered, is this too underpowered? But you obviously take evenly for both, it doesn't really matter, I'm not going to favour one over the other. If it's a little bit overpowered or a little bit underpowered, I'd still dock the same amount of points. This first episode we're only going to be covering 4 cards. However, 2 of these cards are made by someone who ended up actually getting hired as a designer for Undercards, so obviously that's a good sign. That person being Lily Archwitch. Oh wait, never mind, they changed their name. Lily Card Architect. Oh wait, never mind, they changed their name. Lily the Witchest of Lilies? Oh wait, never mind, they changed. Okay, so their name on the official Undercards Discord server is Azza. Either way, they made this card Lost Girl, obviously off of Noelle. It's a 5 cost 2 full legendary, and if you spent gold on spells the last turn, and when you play her, she'll cast the highest cost non-token spell from your deck, and it will target an enemy if possible. They mentioned that this was directly inspired by High Abyss Allura from Hearthstone, and yeah, I can see that. These do seem like relatively similar cards. And we're off to a strong start, because I'd give this a 9 out of 10 on design. I really like the design of this card, and you could say that I'm a little bit biased, because if you don't know, I absolutely love things that pull from the deck in card games. Any kind of effect that like just pulls something from your deck if it meets the conditions and plays it straight away, I think is really cool and satisfying to pull off. And although this is a pretty simple example of a mechanic like that, it still would be very effective in my opinion and would create a lot of interesting deck building kind of scenarios. I imagine this is going to be satisfying as hell to play with, but there's just a small issue I have with it, which is why I've kind of docked some points from the design. Just one though. In all honesty, I'm not a big fan of if you spend gold on spells last turn as a mechanic. I don't think it's like inherently stupid, but like, even though I know it's in the official game, I've never really been a big fan of it, because I feel like it just feels really awkward and annoying to play with, unless you're playing a deck that has enough cheap enough spells that you can reliably be spending gold on spells basically every single turn. So chances are that, you know, you will be able to play these things even if you didn't delay it a turn, you know, in preparation for it. I think if you have to delay your play by 1 turn to be able to do it, I think a lot of the time that just ends up making the game less fun. It just creates a lot of moments where you're like, God damn it, if I could just play this thing right now, I know that I could use it on this, and then that would cause like a massive game-swinging scenario. But I can't do it this turn because I didn't play a spell last turn, because I didn't know I was going to be able to play this card right now, and there was no way I could have known, and now that I do know I could do this, it's too late, and now I'm going to spend gold on this spell so I can do it next turn, but then next turn something will happen that stops me from doing it, and I just find that really frustrating. Now, in fairness, I don't think it's that fair to say, oh, got points off of this card for that, considering the fact that it's already a mechanic in the official game. While I have my problems with this mechanic, I can't really blame Azza for that. But personally, I don't really think this card needs a condition. I don't know, you already have to kind of build your deck so that it has a good thing to pull, and it feels like that alone should be the condition. And this extra condition just feels a little bit unnecessary. I mean, it is necessary for the balance, but we're talking about the design here. I'm obviously saying if you remove that condition, compensate for it by, I don't know, increasing the cost a teeny bit. Alternatively, there is another way I could see this card going, which I think would be very interesting, and I actually misinterpreted it as this at first as well. You see, what I thought this card was at first was that it would play a random spell from your deck. I don't know how, I just blanked out the highest cost part, and that was really interesting to me at first, because I thought, well, you're going to have to fill your deck with only expensive spells to make sure that Lost Girl is actually getting a huge spell off of it, so it's worthwhile. But then you also have to run cheap spells to actually activate her in the first place. And that creates this interesting dichotomy of like, do I want to run these cheap spells and risk the possibility of Lost Girl pulling out some garbage that isn't really worth all the effort? Or do I run only expensive spells but then barely ever get an opportunity to play Lost Girl but be guaranteed a huge swing when I do get the chance? I especially like this because that alone would probably make it not good enough to be played even if you did reduce its cost. But then there's obviously the fact that you could use token spells. Because of the fact she can't pull token spells, you could use token spells as the activators. And I thought that was a really interesting concept. But of course then when I reread it and I realized that it only gets the highest cost spell, well, that certainly makes the card more consistent, which certainly has its upsides. I think it removes some of the potential depth of the card. As for the balance of this card, I'm actually giving it an 8. Which some of you might be surprised to see at first, considering the potential power of this card is really through the roof. I mean, there's no cost limit on the spells that she can cast from your deck, and of course, the current design as is, as opposed to like my alternate design that I proposed, obviously always casts the highest cost spell. So all you gotta do is just put in a really expensive spell in your deck, and you're guaranteed that when you play this, you pull it out and get a huge play. I mean, this really gets out of hand when you realize that, wow, I'm only paying 5 for this, and I can play a spell of any cost with it. It doesn't matter if it costs more than 5, I still get to play it for free from that deck. That almost doesn't seem fair. But when you actually start looking at the targets for this, the kind of spells that you're actually going to be pulling, you start to realize why this wouldn't necessarily break the game wide open straight away. Don't get me wrong, I still think this card is overpowered, which is why it's getting an 8 and not a 10. But I don't think it's really that far off, to be honest. First of all, what is the most expensive non-token spell in the game? Hypergonna, right? 11 cost, kill all units. Now you could think to yourself, wow, this card is busted with Hypergonna, because you just pay 5 and you get a 2/4 and a Hypergonna together. That's amazing. Only it's not really that great because of course the Hypergonna is going to kill your 2/4. So really it's just a discount on a Hypergonna. Which, I mean, that's not useless. I mean, it's a 6 gold discount in total, but it is just a discount on a Hypergonna. You don't get the stats bundled with it as well because the Hypergonna will kill the stats you put on the board. And you can kind of think of it as a third copy of Hypergonna, I guess, in that you're more likely to draw a way to get Hypergonna. But not in the way that you literally get to play 3 Hypergonnas in the game. Obviously, you still would only have 2. Now, don't get me wrong, that is strong. But when you then take into account the fact that Lost Girl has this when you spent gold on spells last turn condition, then I think things start to get really rocky. You see, Hypergonna usually really needs to be played at the perfect time to maximize its value. And that doesn't mean the card is bad. I mean, if anything, that's part of why it's so good. You hold it and you wait until eventually the board's going to be aligned in some way that you can get ridiculously enormous value off of a single Hypergonna. But of course, unless you're running a really spell spammy deck, which is going to be really hard in determination, considering that you don't have a lot of good cheap spells. I don't know, I guess you have Soul Train. Unless you're running a deck like that, you can't reliably meet this condition whenever you want. You probably can activate it once you realize you need it, but once you realize you need it, you're going to have to wait a full turn. And in that full turn, it's probably too late already for Hypergonna to be useful. You see, usually the best time to play Hypergunner is the turn before you're likely to die. So having to wait one extra turn to get your Hypergunner out, even for a 6 gold discount on it, is not worth it. By the way, that's another reason why I give the design a 9 out of 10, despite the issues that I had with it, is even though I overall don't like the condition of having to spend gold on spells the turn before, I have to admit that in this context, it does help balance out the worst case scenario of this pulling out Hypergunner. That being said, Hypergunner isn't the only good target, of course. Where a card like this would be most likely to see play would probably be Justice. Justice has a wealth of very powerful low-cost spells that they would probably be putting in their deck anyway, and it has 2 huge spells that are really good targets for Lost Girl. We have Powerhouse, which of course doesn't target anything, so you don't have to worry about what it targets. And of course it's a 7 cost spell that you'd now be playing for 5 and getting a 2/4 for free with it. But even more importantly, Headshot, which yes, you cannot choose the target of it, but it does say targets enemies if possible. So you can think of this like a Devil's Knife with silence attached to it. The Devil's Knife itself is already a card that's a little bit overpowered on purpose, since you can't actually put it in your deck, you need to get it as a chaos weapon. So getting a Devil's Knife for the same cost that comes with a 2/4 that also silences, even if conditional, is pretty good. Besides those options though, there's not many that you'd really want off of this card. I mean, of course we've already said Hypergunner, Headshot and Powerhouse. There is Wear Form, but it would target enemies every time and you wouldn't be able to choose the enemies, so I don't even think you could say this would be good for a lock deck. So that's kind of out of the question. There is Test of Will with Kindness, that's decent, especially because although Test of Will does damage Lost Girl herself, it doesn't fully kill her. So you do get a 2/2 bundled with your 7 cost spell for 5, which don't get me wrong, that's good, it's just if you're building the deck around this, it's not really a game-winning thing. You do have Contamination with Perseverance, which could be strong. You do have Poison as a very easy activator, but also having to line up the damaged monsters makes me think that's probably not going to be very consistent. And that only leaves one more spell which I think would actually be worth using this card on, which would be Ambush in Bravery, which, in fairness, might be very good in the right deck, but it would probably take a lot of effort. You'd really have to find some good ambush targets. But I will admit that's a pretty big tempo play. Ambush in its own right is already a card that's kind of awful for long-term value, but in exchange it gives you a very big power spike the turn you play it. And Ambush with Lost Girl would just add even more tempo onto it by playing it for 1 gold less and getting a 2/4 with it. Side note, apparently Headshot costs 6, and I feel really stupid right now because I don't think that was a recent change. I don't know how long I've been going in this game thinking that Headshot still costed 7. Either way, I'm not cutting up that all out now and doing it again. Point still stands that Headshot is equally as good with this card still. So anyway, how would I balance this card? Well, there's 2 ways I go about it. The first way I might go about it is just simply increase its cost by 1. I considered maybe it needed to cost 7, but I feel like you can only make an argument for it costing 7 if every soul was as good with this card as Justice is. Admittedly, a 6 cost version of this card is still very good with Justice, but it's not really so overpowered with any of the other ones. So yeah, I really think all you have to do to this card to make it balance is put 1 extra cost on it. And hey, totem synergy, I guess. The other route, which I'm not going to say is necessarily superior, obviously they both have their merits, but as I say, I really like the idea of making it so this card isn't guaranteed to pull the most expensive spell from your deck. The other direction that you could potentially take this is, instead of it costing 1 more, just add what I suggested of it not guaranteeing to pull the most expensive spell, so that you have to run a deck with only expensive spells and either generate the cheap spells or run them in the deck and just run the risk that they get pulled from the deck. With that extra caveat of having to put that extra effort in to actually get the effect to go off, I think this is fine as a 5 cost, because even though it could be really huge, you would have to be putting in a lot of effort to get that huge high roll. Anyway, I just wanted to start with that one, because that one's definitely one of my favourites out of all the cards I've seen so far. But of course, I mentioned there were 2 cards by this person. The second one is Royal Librarian, and I am very mixed on it. It's an 8 cost 3/4 with magic, summon all generated monsters with a base cost of 6 or less from your hand. So I gave this a 6 for design, which sounds a bit harsh, but I do want to clarify as well. I know that this should really go without saying, but a lot of the time when people say about like, oh, something's 10 out of 10 or whatever, they rate things on a scale out of 10. They treat 7 like it's average, when that's supposed to be obviously above average, and 5 is average. When I give a card a 6, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm still saying that's better than the average card idea. And I do think this is better than the average card idea. But I think the main problem with this card is its design. You see, the reason I'm so mixed on this is because it's simultaneously very good and very bad. What I like a lot about it is that this is a great support card for so many decks. It does technically have a sort of quote-unquote archetype of generated cards, but obviously generated cards are really easy to mix with other archetypes that already exist. So this isn't just bound to one deck. It's not like you could only run this in a plant deck, or you could only run this in a spider deck. There's a bunch of different types of decks that could run this card, but it's not like it's a card with no synergy. It's a very synergetic card. It's just that the synergy is something that so many decks are capable of doing that it doesn't lock it down to one deck, which I really like about it. That's the part I really enjoy about it. The problem is the reward. It makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't actually, I think, make for a very good card. The reward, as it says, is summoning all generated monsters with a base cost of 6 or less from your hand. Summoning from your hand is always a weird one, because, first of all, I have to explain quite briefly just to people who maybe this is a bit of a strange concept to them, but you have to realize that you're not actually gaining any long-term value by summoning something from your hand. If anything, you're kind of quote-unquote losing value, because especially if the card has an on-play ability, like a delay or a magic, you don't get that ability, but in exchange, you get to play that card from your hand without having to spend the gold. So the first thing you have to realize is that this card isn't a finisher for a control, like, late game deck. Even though it might seem like it. The idea is, oh, I'm going to build up all these huge generated monsters that cost 6, and then I'm going to play them all from my hand instantly, and it's going to be a big finisher. It is a finisher card, but not really for a late game strategy, because in a late game strategy, you dump your entire hand with Royal Librarian, and if you're against a deck that has the capabilities to wipe your board even once, like Test of Will or Hypergoner, and they do that, then you lose instantly on the spot, because you lost all the cards in your hand when you played this, and even though you got loads of stuff onto the board for free, basically, they all died instantly, and now you have basically an empty hand and no more value, like, in your deck, so you're gonna lose. That doesn't mean that this is a weak effect. Obviously, that's the bad side of it. The good side of it is when you play this early, before your opponent's got enough gold to play something like that, or before they're established on the board, and just get a whole bunch of stuff on the board way faster than they can and overwhelm them with it. And I have to admit, that would probably be very satisfying, but of course, then it kind of gets into the territory of this card is always super underpowered or super overpowered. Now, I say that, it's not really that bad. I mean, I think that on average, this card probably won't be fluctuating too much. But it does seem like a very matchup dependent card. Like, if you're going against control, I think you just cry if you have this card. It does nothing for you. It gets your stuff out earlier, but then if they can have enough gold for the board clear, which 9 times out of 10, unless you get this card out really fast, they will, then, you know, you're just dead. They just wipe your board, you dump your whole hand, you're out of stuff, you lose. But as I say, any other matchup, if you're against aggro and at least one of those things is a taunt, and then you get all that stats, all of the stats on the board, the aggro deck is never going to get back on the board. They don't have the tools to do it, and unless they have the burn to kill you over the top, then you just win. And of course against combo, this murders them, because combo needs the time to set up its degenerate combos and OTKs and ways to kill you without having to care about the board, and then you get on the board so fast that they do have to care about the board because they're going to be dead in 2 turns if they don't do something about it. Basically, I mean, I've kind of already pointed out a decent amount, but to be 100% clear, this card is a full-on mid-range card, but that's almost kind of a bad thing because it's such a mid-range card that it feels like it would be very matchup dependent how good it would feel to play, to the point where if it is control you're against, it would just be awful playing this card. I do like, though, they specifically made it a base cost of 6 or less. I'm almost certain that's intentional, so that you use it with Draft and Bravery's passive to really charge it up a whole bunch. And of course, this card was actually made before the Soulless Chris rework, but now with the new reworked Soulless Chris, admittedly that could be a really good combo. That way you might be able to put this into a control deck. But despite how much sense it makes for this to synergize with recruitment and bravery passive, that's also another concern I have with the design of this card, is that it almost seems like it synergizes so well with bravery passive and recruitment that you probably wouldn't even build your deck around this card. Like, I feel like, especially because it's a Librarian, they were intending this to be a card you use with, well, Librarian in singleton decks. But I don't think that's how it would be used. I imagine this would just go into mid-range decks, and the mid-range decks would draw no generated synergy for the most part, except there would just be bravery decks that also happen to run Reinforcements artifact, and I think that's all they would need. Like, they would just have enough generated cards to get big value for Royal Librarian then. Especially because if you run normal generation cards, like cards that generate more cards that aren't recruitment or bravery passive, if you do that, then you run into another problem of now you're not guaranteed to get something that costs 6 or less, or it could cost 6 or less, but it could be like a 1-drop or a 2-drop, which is really bad value. And especially because you only have 3 board slots, and there's a good chance you might have actually more than 3 generated targets in your hand, it could in fact take the spot of a much better card, those smaller cards. So it starts to look like it's actually better to run this card with no synergy in your deck and just have your synergy be bravery passive plus reinforcements. And by the way, I have just realized now that I've been calling draft recruitment, and I was thinking I couldn't remember the name of the bravery passive one, and that's recruitment. Well, again, not cutting it out. So yeah, hopefully you can see why I'm so torn on this design. I do love cheating things out for cheap prices. I think that's a really satisfying and fun mechanic. But I think doing it en masse like this is so swingy that it'd probably be frustrating, either for the person dealing with it because they're going to get steamrolled, or for the person doing it if they're against a deck that has board clears. That combined with the fact that I don't think that this card, you know, is actually going to be run in generated synergy decks, it's just going to be run in mid-range decks with recruitment and bravery, makes me think that I should probably give it a 6 in design. That being said though, I will give this card a 7 in balance, which might come off as a little bit of a shock to some of you, considering how swingy I just said this card was, that it will absolutely steamroll people if it does work, and it will work against more people than it won't work against. As I said, it's mostly decks with board clears that will screw this card over. But again, I think that's more a design problem than a balance problem. I think on average, this card probably does average out to being relatively balanced, but once again, probably a little bit on the strong side. Just because I think it's not hard to get 3 generated monsters in your hand that cost 6 or less, and if you do that, let's just say for argument's sake, you've got a 5 cost, a 6 cost, and another 5 cost. Then you are going to get a 3-4 bundle with this as well, which is worth 3 gold. 3 gold, and then 16 gold. 19 gold worth of value off of an 8-drop. Now, to be fair, that's unfair, because those things that you're going to summon for your hand, 1, you obviously had to set that up, but 2, those things in your hand are not going to use their on-played abilities, and because you're just looking at random cards, you really can't guarantee that those cards aren't going to have on-play abilities that you're going to miss out on. You probably are going to miss out on some on-play abilities, there's some magic abilities, some delay abilities, which does take away some of the value. And of course, these cards are also cards you probably wouldn't want to run in your deck anyway. So 19 gold isn't a true amount. But even taking all that into account, it's probably going to be something like 15, 14 gold worth of stuff you're cheating out for 8. Yeah, again, I think it is overtuned. I think there is this is one of those things where if it was added to the game, there would be counterplay, but that wouldn't mean it wouldn't be good for that. It would be fine and it would be good for the game. You could counter this, but you would have to just not play certain decks. I think you would just not play aggro unless it was very burn-heavy aggro that just got on the board really quick, and then the second they start losing the board, they just spam burn at your face and hope you die before they get killed themselves. I think unless you pivoted to that, aggro would just be dead if this card got added to the game. Again, that might sound a little bit strange, but mid-range does beat aggro because it usually has bigger stats than aggro. It usually has taunts, and the bigger stats that it has over aggro allows it to trade into all its units really favorably. So as long as the aggro doesn't get the over-the-top damage to kill the mid-range deck, The mid-range decks usually just get to trade into everything the aggro player plays, and they lose the board, and then they die because they have no high-value cards in their deck because they're aggro. So yeah, I think this card is a 7 in balance. I don't think it's that crazy over the top, as I say. I think there would be counterplay, and I do think that this card would be garbage against control, but as I say, I think it'd be a bit unhealthy. I think the game would switch to just like, okay, everyone's playing control now, or Royal Librarian decks. So yeah, those were the 2 cards by Azza. I had to think about it for a second because of all the different names. The other 2 cards that I will be covering today are from Windows Junior in my Discord server, and they are both for the Undertale Yellow AU. If you don't know what I'm on about, essentially Undertale AUs are kind of like fan-made alternate universes, what they stand for, basically what if scenarios, what if Undertale but this happened. And Undertale Yellow is one of the more well-known ones, where essentially it follows the story of the Yellow Soul's journey through the underground, the one representing Justice, who used to own the cowboy hat and the gun that you can find in the game. This is also one of the most well-known ones because it has its own fan game demo, which was really, really impressive. Like, before Deltarune, because it came out before Deltarune, it was like the closest thing we had to Undertale 2. And apparently we're finally going to get the full game next winter, which was a shock to me. I was thinking at this point, after so many years, it must have been forgotten about. But no, they've still been working on it the whole time. But anyways, I digress, of course. These 2 cards are obviously based off of characters we saw in the demo of Undertale Yellow, which only contained the Ruins area. In Undertale Yellow, it starts mostly the same as the original Undertale. When Toriel tries to guide you through the ruins, you fall through a crack in the floor and end up in a place below the ruins, which is relatively similar, but obviously all abandoned and dark and a bit more dangerous. And it's there where you meet one of the new characters in Undertale Yellow, Dalv, this very lonely vampire. So, let's get the elephant in the room out of the way. The art on these cards is amazing. Like, actually better than the official game for the most part. With that big compliment out of the way, I can't say as much for the card ideas themselves. Well, I can't be too harsh. Let's actually get into them, starting with Dalv. I give Dalv a 3 for design. And I do kind of hate doing that, because part of me as a control player does really like the look of this card, but I know deep down a card like this is not healthy for the game. So the main problem with this card is, by God, would this be so annoying. Like, even as a control player who really likes to use tools that keep themselves alive and all that, I'm looking at this like, Jesus Christ, I would hate this card. Overall, I think that silence is a pretty annoying mechanic in Undercards overall. It makes sense in a lot of other games, but with Undercards, it's already like, stats matter so much, and, you know, abilities don't matter quite as much. So it really sucks when the abilities start to matter even less, because silence just removes them. And I think this game already has enough silence. Like, I keep talking about how important it is. Scarf Mouse is still one of the best base cards in the game, despite, you know, it's a 3-star card, but it's still a staple in so many top tier decks. I don't think the game needs much more silence. And I definitely do not think this game needs mass silence. At the very least, if a mass silence card was to be added to the game, I think it should either be something super conditional, a DT, or it should be something only one soul gets to have. As a neutral legendary, mass silence sounds awful. That sounds like it would be painful to play against. I think silence and paralyze together on every single enemy, and the fact that it specifies enemies means that it wouldn't affect your own side of the board as well, makes this card really, really bad from a design perspective, just because I feel like you just... what does an aggro player do? Like, they've not even killed your units, so they can't even put new units in the slots that their old units used to be to try and get the burst damage in to get you over the top or try and make some kind of play. Because they're just kind of locked out of the board for a turn, and they lose all the buffs that they built up and all the abilities they've got. I feel like this would just be so awful to play against. I know I keep saying it, but just, like, I don't know what else to say. Like, that's the biggest problem with this card. I suppose another criticism I could give to be a little bit less repetitive is that it also is kind of a card that doesn't really have much in terms of, like, niche of, like, how to think about how to most efficiently clear a board. Like, you know, there are some board clears where when you use them, you really have to think about, okay, how do I set up this board so I get the maximum value off this board clear? Even simple stuff like Hypergoner, because of the fact that's a symmetrical effect and wipes your own board as well. But then if you don't play anything on your board, then your opponent probably won't develop into it because they'll know the Hypergoner's coming. It leads to some really interesting situations where you have to play some units onto the board, even if you know you're going to Hypergoner a lot of the time, to try and bait your opponent to commit more onto the board to get big Hypergoners. And, you know, even with a simple kill-all like that, there's some mind games to it. And obviously with other ones like Carousel is probably the best example. That's one that takes a lot of effort to set up. But then you look at this. It doesn't affect your side of the board. It affects all enemies, and basically every enemy is going to be affected hugely by being both silenced and paralyzed. Only, like, cards that are literally all stats with no buffs on them would not, like, be affected much by this. So I feel like you don't have to think much about when to play this. It's just, oh, they've got a full board and I'm starting to get a little bit low on health. Oh, they lost. And I do think this would be a very game-winning card based off of that. I think as soon as you get enough gold to play it, you slam this down and you use the paralyzed turn to get stuff onto your board. So even though it doesn't kill the units, it will be very easy to kill them once they're unparalyzed, if they're even still a threat after being silenced. I don't know what else to say, really. It's just Paralyze and Silence is a very frustrating combo, and Mass Paralyze and Silence for every single soul that isn't even a DT sounds like a nightmare. Just imagine a deck being able to duplicate this card and play it, like, every single turn. Like, ugh. All that said, though, I will give this card a 9 in balance. I do think this is overall pretty quote-unquote balanced. Again, I think that it's unbalanced in the way it's designed, so that's more a design problem, because again, I think that if you use this against aggro, it's an auto-win button. If you use it against most other decks, it's probably relatively fair. And in fact, it'd probably be pretty garbage against combo, because they don't have anything on the board for you to care about. Unless you silence an important part of their combo, then yeah, I don't think that combo really cares when you play this card. I don't think you would need to really nerf it much. It's probably a little overtuned, because I think this effect is stronger than Mad Dummy's effect by a little bit. And this has better stats than Mad Dummy. I would say 6/6 is better than 7/4. Although, no, wait, they did buff Mad Dummy to cost 1 less, so yeah. I don't know, still, I think it probably would need some small toning down, just have less stats, I guess, would probably be what I recommend. I don't mind if it's still got 6 health and it's still rather, like, tough and hard to remove from the board. I want to give it 6 attack, I would say. But as I say, that's a nitpick, that's why it's a 9 in balance. I do think on average this card is probably pretty balanced, on average. The problem is that it's going to fluctuate so hard based on deck type that it's not going to be it's not going to feel very balanced, even if it is quote-unquote balanced. But again, that's a design problem, not a balance problem. To be honest, I know this has been almost a recurring theme, this talking about, well, this card's design isn't that great because it destroys this one archetype. It's like really good against mid-range, it's really good against aggro, whatever, whichever one it is. In fairness, that's kind of one of the main problems with Undercards as a whole, is that sometimes the matchmaking can get really rock, paper, scissory. Like, the meta can just be like, if I'm this deck and I queue into this deck, I auto-win. To the point where the community's obviously made their own term for this now. It's called getting nuanced, when you just queue into a deck where the second your deck goes against their deck, you've kind of already lost. Like, it doesn't matter what you do. It's really, really unlikely, even with God draws, that you can beat that type of deck with your type of deck. And that doesn't necessarily mean that your deck is underpowered or their deck is overpowered. It just means that deck specifically really screws your deck specifically. That's one of the larger problems with Undercards as a whole at the moment, so it kind of makes sense that a lot of the custom cards also are struggling with that issue. But anyway, let's move on to the other card, which even though it also has one very low rating, I think this card could very easily be fixed into a very fun and very balanced card. And that second card is Toriel Yellow, a 10-cost 1/6, which when played will look at all cards in your opponent's hand and choose one to give +4 cost, and then she gains attack equal to half the monster's new cost. Originally, this card gave it only +2 cost, but gained attack equal to the full cost of the monster after the cost increase. But I suggested they change it, and that's what they did when I suggested that maybe they make it so the cost increase was larger, but the attack increase wasn't as much. Even still, I'm not gonna lie, I think this card is absurdly underpowered. Like, I usually split this into a design and a balance section, and I want to here, but like the design section and the balance section kind of overlap a little bit here. I give it a 9 in design. I really like this idea. I give it a 1 in balance. This is terribly, awfully underpowered. Like, this would never see play, I don't think. Like, it would have to be a very, very specific meta where you want multiple tutorials, but you can't have multiple tutorials, so you run this instead of having another tutorial. You would need a very specific situation like that for this card to be good. You can probably see why. This is really, really insignificant for 10. And I hope this doesn't come off as like a nasty surprise that I'm digging into it from Just Junior, because to be fair, I didn't say much else after they like changed it once, even though I still thought it was really underpowered. But I just kind of thought, what's the point of me doing this critique segment in my custom cards videos if I'm just going to tell you everything I would do to it, like ahead of time, and then you just put that card out? So I thought, okay, I've said what I think they should do to it, and they've tried to improve it, but it's still really underpowered. I'm just going to leave it at that, and I'm going to leave my thoughts for now, which is obviously why I'm doing it now. So yeah, this would never see play. Obviously the comparison to Teacher Toriel is already there. Teacher Toriel is of course a 6 cost 6/4 that's already in the game that lets you look at your opponent's entire hand, and instead of just increasing the cost of a card in their hand, actually yoink one of their cards and put it back into their deck so that it's essentially gone. Like, they can get it back if they can draw it back from their deck, but most decks don't draw out their entire deck in a full game. And that means that usually once you put that card back into their deck, unless you're unlucky, that card's gone, like for the rest of the game. They're never going to see it again. Again, it's not impossible for them to get it back, but it's not easy. And if they do get it back, it will be like 5, 6, 10, maybe even turns from now. It could even be 20 or whatever. So it's basically deleting a card from their hand. So when you compare these two, you've got Teacher Toriel, which costs way less while still having a decent stat line, which deletes a card from their hand, essentially. And Toriel Yellow, who is a 10 cost to start with, takes up your entire gold for the turn, unless you save gold from the previous turn. Doesn't delete the card, just makes it more expensive. And then on top of that, her stats is dependent on the card that you increase the cost of. It's especially bad because when you increase the cost of something, you kind of get diminishing returns if you target a card that's already really expensive. But then if you don't target a card that's already really expensive, the stats of this monster is going to be garbage. Like, if you target a 1 cost with this, it doesn't say if it's rounded up or rounded down, but I'm just going to assume, give them the benefit of doubt and assume rounded up. If that's the case, that still makes this a 10 cost 4/6 that does less than Teacher Toriel, which is a 6 cost 6/4. That's awful. Now, to be fair, as I say, this card is clearly meant to be used on higher cost units, but again, that means that they have less of an impact, but let's just forget about that for now. Let's say you use this on their Kara. Big play. That was an 18 cost unit. Toriel Yellow gets +9 attack. That makes her a 10/6. Wait, did I say +9? Yeah, +9, yeah, sorry. I went back to think it was +2 cost like the first version of the card. No, it's +4 cost, so yes, that's right. It would have +9 attack. That would make this a 10 cost 10/6. Is it me, or is that still objectively worse than Teacher Toriel? Like, if you high roll with Toriel Yellow, you get a Teacher Toriel that costs 4 more to get +4, +2, which I don't think is really worth it. And then on top of that, it doesn't even delete the card from their hand, it just makes it more expensive. It's like, ooh, yeah, that's bad. Especially because an effect like this is especially more valuable on cheaper cards. The extra stats is not worth the extra cost. And that's, again, that's the high roll with this card. That is the, like, better case scenario. This is pretty awful. You see, when I was trying to tell Windust about, like, the card, I mean, to be fair, again, I'm not saying that he wasn't listening, because he was, and I, to be fair, tried to word it nicely, but it might have been too passive to the point where it sounded like it was just a small issue. But I was saying I don't think that it's going to be that relevant, the attack boost. But then they were saying that stuff like, oh, but you could use it on like load with Omega Flower, you know, and that's a 17 cost spell, and it goes up to 21, and then Toriel Yellow would have gotten plus 20 attack. With this version, she would still get plus 10 attack. Even then, a 10 cost 11/6 with a downgraded teacher tutorial effect. Like, even when there's massively high rolls, it's just bad. Like, simply this card needs to cost less, and I think that it needs to, well, actually, I think plus 4 cost is fine. It needs to cost less. I actually personally would also like if it could increase the cost of maybe multiple cards if you didn't reduce the cost. Like, if it still costed 10, maybe have this ability, but just have it trigger twice. I don't know. With that said, I don't know if you could do that, but you could probably do it if you made it a magic and a delay. Can you make a delay selected? Like a selected target? I just realized you might not be able to. Well, anyway, you get what I'm talking about. You could just bring up the menu twice, I suppose. There's not much to say here. I think this idea is really good. In fact, what I mentioned earlier about having diminishing returns when you do it on stuff that's already really expensive, technically that is quote-unquote good design, because that means there's good reason to pick both. If you pick the cheaper ones, then you're getting more out of the cost increase, but if you pick the more expensive ones, you're getting more out of the attack boost. And that is good design. The problem is that both of them are irrelevant with this card because it's so underpowered. That's why it's getting a 9 in design. I actually really like this design. I love this hand disruption, especially in Undercards. I think hand disruption is really important in Undercards. I think in other games it can be really annoying a lot of the time. But in Undercards, if you just let people do whatever they want with their hands, there's some super degenerate garbage they can get away with. So I think that hand disruption needs to exist like this to make sure that stuff like that doesn't happen. And there's always counterplay to it. So I love this as a hand disruption card. I love the idea. I think it's very balanced. I think it's very good design in concept. It's just way too weak to ever be like possible to do. But as I say, I think it's quite an easy fix. I think you just make it a lot cheaper, or you make its ability trigger multiple times. Anyway, those are all the custom cards for this first episode, and I'll see you in the next one. What? What about my voice? There's nothing strange about my voice.